The corridors of Kensington Palace have long been engineered to swallow sound, to absorb the friction of history before it can ever ripple outward into the public consciousness. Within these limestone walls, power does not shout. It whispers, operating through the steady, almost imperceptible turning of bureaucratic gears, centuries of protocol, and documents signed in fading ink. Yet, there are moments when the silence itself becomes heavy, vibrating with an internal tension that signals a seismic shift within the House of Windsor. This was precisely the atmosphere that settled over the estate on a seemingly ordinary morning. A cold quiet that began not with an open confrontation, but with a piece of paper, an administrative review buried deep within the layers of royal inheritance files. It was an oversight, or perhaps a calculated gamble by factions operating within the broader machinery of the court, a minor adjustment to the destination of a legendary artifact, Princess Diana's iconic sapphire brooch. For decades, this particular piece had rested in the heavily guarded vaults of the royal collection, a mesmerizing deep blue stone wrapped in clusters of brilliant diamonds, carrying with it not just immense material value, but the literal emotional fingerprint of a woman who had fundamentally redefined what it meant to wear the crown. To the institutional machinery of the palace, jewelry is often treated as currency, tokens of status, and diplomatic tools to be rotated, archived, or reassigned to suit the shifting alliances and public choreography of the family. But to a son who had watched his mother wear that very sapphire as armor against the crushing weight of institutional isolation, the brooch was never just property. It was a sacred piece of an untouched legacy, a physical bridge to a memory that he had spent his entire adult life fiercely protecting from exploitation and revision. When Prince William reportedly discovered, entirely by accident through a routine update from archival staff, that this deeply personal heirloom had been quietly earmarked and promised to another household within the family without his prior knowledge or consent, the internal climate of Kensington Palace transformed overnight. It was a moment where the boundary between royal duty and personal grief completely dissolved, triggering an immediate, uncompromising reaction from the future king that caught even his most seasoned senior aides completely off guard. The mechanism of this crisis began in the shadows of an internal administrative audit, a process so routine that it rarely commands the attention of senior royals. In the vast and labyrinthine structure of the royal collection, thousands of priceless items are continuously cataloged, cleaned, and designated for upcoming state visits, photographic sessions, and official portraits. It is a world governed by senior courtiers, individuals who have spent their entire careers mastering the subtle nuances of palace protocol, where decisions are made through a network of committees that operate with a degree of autonomy that can occasionally blur the lines of direct authority. According to inner circle sources, a quiet meeting had been convened to streamline the distribution of historic jewelry among the various active households of the monarchy. It was during these discussions that the sapphire brooch, an item intrinsically linked in the public imagination to the late Princess of Wales, was placed on a list for reassignment. The justifications presented behind closed doors were wrapped in the language of efficiency and tradition, suggesting that the piece had remained stagnant for too long and needed to be brought back into active public service to reinforce the visual continuity of the crown. However, the crucial error, the spark that would ignite a silent war between the competing households, was the decision to advance this paperwork through private channels without consulting the Prince of Wales. In the modern structure of the monarchy, there is an unwritten code, an understanding born from years of public and private turbulence, that items explicitly associated with Princess Diana's personal life and emotional narrative are subject to a different standard of care. They are not merely assets. They are historical landmines, charged with the memories of a fractured era that the institution has spent decades attempting to heal. To bypass William on such a matter was not just a breach of administrative etiquette. It was interpreted within Kensington Palace as a profound provocation, a deliberate testing of boundaries by an old guard that still occasionally views the younger generation of royals as subjects to be managed rather than leaders who define the trajectory of the institution. As the realization of what had occurred rippled through William's immediate circle, the polished composure that defines daily life at Kensington Palace began to fracture. The tension did not manifest in explosive arguments or public statements, but in a sudden, defensive withdrawal. Senior aides, individuals who pride themselves on their ability to project absolute serenity regardless of the internal chaos, were observed looking visibly anxious, moving through the private quarters with an unusual urgency. Internal briefings were abruptly canceled with little to no explanation, and junior staff members were quietly but firmly warned by their superiors to avoid any discussion of family heirlooms or internal asset reviews in areas where their conversations could be overheard. The atmosphere became brittle, characterized by long, uncomfortable silences in meetings that normally proceeded with fluid efficiency. Royal correspondents, who have spent decades learning to read the subtle body language of the court, quickly picked up on the shift. There was a distinct lack of coordination between the communication teams of the different households, a coldness in the exchange of emails, and a sudden reluctance to share scheduling data. This was the silent language of a palace in crisis, a realization that a line had been crossed that could not easily be uncrossed. The gravity of the situation was compounded by the fact that the brooch was not just any piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of Diana's independence, worn during moments when she was actively asserting her identity outside the rigid confines of traditional expectations. For William, the discovery that such an object could be manipulated behind the scenes, treated as a pawn in an internal game of influence and status, was deeply destabilizing. It suggested that despite his position as the direct heir to the throne, there were still factions within the palace walls who believed they could quietly rewrite the narrative of his family's history, diluting the legacy of his mother by absorbing her most personal artifacts back into the anonymous machinery of the institutional collective. In the midst of this gathering storm, the public eye remained focused on the family's outward-facing duties, entirely unaware of the administrative battle being waged behind the heavy oak doors. Yet for those trained to look closer, there were signs that the pressure was taking a toll. During a scheduled public engagement that should have been an effortless display of royal grace, the Princess of Wales appeared to some observers as unusually subdued. Catherine, whose public persona is defined by an unwavering, natural confidence, and a warmth that bridges the gap between the monarchy and the public, carried an expression that a veteran royal photographer described as carrying a visible emotional heaviness. While she executed her duties with her characteristic professionalism, smiling at the crowds and engaging with dignitaries, there was a quiet, protective stillness about her that hinted at the serious discussions taking place within her household. Palace officials were quick to dismiss any insinuation of internal strain, releasing standard statements emphasizing the success of the engagement and the family's focus on their charitable initiatives. But within the media landscape, the whispers had already taken root. Journalists who cover the royal beat knew that Catherine does not easily betray emotion in public. If she appeared even slightly burdened, it was a testament to the magnitude of the conflict unfolding in private. She was not just a witness to this crisis. She was William's primary confidant, the person who understood more than anyone else the deep, lingering wounds left by the events of 1997. She knew that for her husband, protecting Diana's memory was not an act of sentimentality, but a fundamental duty of his life, a boundary that he could never allow to be compromised. Her quiet presence beside him during this period was not a sign of weakness, but a deliberate projection of solidarity, a signal to the rest of the institution that Kensington Palace stood united against any attempt to diminish the emotional inheritance of their family. The true turning point arrived when Prince William personally demanded an immediate, exhaustive clarification from the senior administrators responsible for the archival reassignment. The confrontation, as described by those familiar with the internal workings of the palace, was a masterclass in controlled authority. William did not raise his voice. He did not engage in the dramatic theatricality that often characterizes fictional portrayals of royal disputes. Instead, he brought a cold, razor-sharp focus to the meeting, a demand for absolute transparency that left the assembled courtiers with nowhere to hide. He wanted to know exactly who had initiated the paperwork, which private channels had been used to bypass his office, and what the ultimate destination of the sapphire brooch was intended to be. Different interpretations of this meeting suggest that the future king viewed the situation not as a simple mistake or a failure of communication, but as a direct challenge to the sacred understanding that protects his mother's historical memory. To William, certain aspects of Princess Diana's life and the items she left behind are entirely untouchable, elevated above the daily politics and administrative maneuvers of the court. The idea that a bureaucratic committee could decide to reallocate an object of such immense emotional significance without his explicit authorization was an existential threat to that principle. It was an indication that if he did not act decisively, the erosion of his mother's distinct legacy would continue, piece by piece, until her memory was completely subjugated to the institutional needs of the crown. The determination in his voice sent a clear, undeniable message through the corridors of power. The era where the Prince of Wales could be managed or kept out of the loop on matters of deeply personal significance was permanently over, replaced by a leader who was fully prepared to wield his authority to protect the history of his bloodline. As the first chapter of this silent conflict drew to a close, the immediate focus shifted from a simple disagreement over a piece of historical jewelry to a comprehensive containment operation initiated by Kensington Palace. By the following morning, the daily routines of the estate had been completely overhauled to accommodate a series of high-level, confidential strategy sessions. William personally convened a trusted inner circle of advisors, legal experts, and archival specialists, individuals whose loyalty to his family had been proven over years of navigating the complex terrain of public life. The doors to the briefing rooms were securely guarded, and the atmosphere inside was described as strategic, clinical, and intensely focused. This was no longer a defensive reaction to a provocation. It was the implementation of a structured plan to ensure that such an incident could never happen again. Legal minds connected to the royal collections were tasked with reviewing the specific inheritance laws and organizational policies that govern the movement of historic assets, searching for permanent mechanisms to safeguard items linked to Princess Diana. It was during these intense discussions that aides began to whisper about the emergence of what they called a preservation protocol, an unofficial but deeply binding doctrine designed to permanently anchor these sacred artifacts to William's direct line of descent. The future king was drawing a line in the sand, demonstrating to the entire institutional apparatus that while he remained deeply committed to his duty to the crown, he would never allow that duty to come at the expense of his family's emotional truth. The brooch had become a symbol of a much greater reality. The moment when an heir stops waiting for the future and begins to actively shape the terms of his legacy, ruling with a quiet, formidable strength that would define the path of the monarchy for generations to come. The second phase of this silent war shifted from a defensive containment operation into an intense, historical excavation of the palace's modern jewelry guidelines. Inside the high-walled library of Kensington Palace, beneath portrait paintings of ancestors who had navigated their own dynastic crises, Prince William's legal and historical advisors worked late into the night. They were not looking for loopholes. They were mapping out an emotional boundary line. For William, the sudden and quiet maneuver surrounding the diamond-shrouded sapphire brooch was a painful reminder that within the institutional apparatus of the British monarchy, memories can easily be repackaged, diluted, or absorbed if left unprotected. This brooch carried the distinct, heavy weight of a specific historical era. It was an object that had sat directly over the heart of Princess Diana during the most volatile and transformative years of her life inside the House of Windsor. In the early days of her marriage, the stone had been a glistening symbol of youthful optimism, capturing the world's flashbulbs at diplomatic banquets, charity galas, and historic state occasions. But as the psychological pressure of royal expectations increased and her private isolation deepened behind the closed doors of the court, the public began to perceive her jewelry differently. The brilliant blue stones were no longer mere decorative status symbols. They had transformed into a form of visual armor. Diana wore them as a declaration of resilience, a silent communication of her enduring presence in a system that often sought to minimize her distinct personality. To watch her navigate those public spaces, carrying the heavy weight of both public adoration and deep private loneliness, left an permanent impression on her eldest son. William was not a detached observer. He was a witness to the emotional cost of that historical era. Therefore, the realization that this specific artifact could be treated as a routine bureaucratic asset to be shifted between households without his explicit permission felt less like standard protocol and more like a systematic attempt to erase the distinct boundaries of his mother's personal history. To fully understand the intensity of the current confrontation, one must look back to the subtle, protective measures implemented during the late reign of Queen Elizabeth II. The late monarch, possessing an unparalleled understanding of the symbolic power of the crown's collections, was exceptionally sensitive to the emotional vulnerabilities surrounding the items linked to Diana's memory. According to former palace courtiers, the Queen recognized very early on that the jewelry worn by the late Princess of Wales could never be treated as ordinary institutional heirlooms. She was acutely aware that any public appearance of these distinct stones carried immense political and emotional weight, capable of shifting public sentiment overnight. Consequently, an unwritten protocol had quietly existed during her final decades, a mutual understanding that certain pieces of profound historical significance would remain securely archived until the time came for them to pass directly to Diana's sons. Different interpretations of early palace memos suggest that the Queen quietly respected William's deep emotional attachment to these heirlooms, viewing them not just as valuable gemstones, but as essential pillars of continuity for the future of the monarchy. The sapphire brooch was understood to be a core part of this unwritten agreement, a piece meant to transition directly from the legacy of the late mother to the household of the future king. By bypassing this historical precedent, the administrators who initiated the secret reassignment paperwork had not only violated William's personal boundaries, they had fundamentally disrupted a delicate institutional balance that had been carefully maintained for nearly 30 years. It was an act of administrative overreach that threatened to set a dangerous precedent, suggesting that informal influence within competing factions of the contemporary court could override the established historical understandings intended to protect the Spencer-Windsor line. As the internal investigation deepened under William's direct orders, the focus of the strategy sessions shifted toward the formalization of what staff privately termed the Diana Preservation Protocol. This was not a public declaration, but a highly structured internal framework designed to permanently insulate these emotionally significant artifacts from the shifting dynamics of palace politics. Legal representatives connected to the family's private estates were brought in to consult on the structural governance of the collections, examining the precise legal mechanisms that separate crown assets from personal inheritances. William's objective was clear and absolute. He demanded a permanent, unalterable system of protection for every piece of jewelry, portrait, and personal document associated with his mother's historical legacy. The unofficial doctrine was built upon a singular, powerful premise that certain symbols are so deeply tied to the emotional history of a family that they must remain anchored exclusively to the direct bloodline, rather than being utilized as strategic assets or diplomatic tokens by the wider institution. The future king was actively redefining the rules of engagement within the palace walls, demonstrating an uncompromising leadership style that focused heavily on structural precision rather than emotional spectacle. He did not issue public ultimatums. Instead, he used the quiet power of institutional administration to build an unbreachable wall around his mother's memory. This strategic silence, backed by an ironclad determination, created an intense wave of anxiety among the older generation of courtiers, who quickly realized that the Prince of Wales was no longer a passive participant in the management of the family's historical narrative, but a formidable leader fully prepared to enforce his boundaries. Throughout this period of escalating administrative tension, the focus within Kensington Palace was not merely fixed on the grievances of the past, but on the profound responsibilities of the future. Specifically, the internal discussions centered heavily on Princess Charlotte, who has increasingly become the focal point of both public fascination and family continuity. For years, Royal observers and historical commentators have pointed to the striking emotional and behavioral parallels between the young princess and her late grandmother. It is visible in a sudden gesture, a distinctive smile, or the natural, quiet confidence she displays during her rare public appearances beside her parents. Within the private quarters of the estate, these comparisons carry an immense emotional weight that the outside world rarely glimpses. To William, his daughter represents far more than the future stability of the royal line. She is a living, breathing bridge to the mother he lost during his formative years. This profound connection is precisely why the controversy surrounding the secret reassignment of the sapphire brooch caused such a deep, visceral reaction within his household. The brooch, along with several other carefully preserved heirlooms, had never been viewed by William and Catherine as mere historic valuables to be stored indefinitely in dark palace vaults. They were explicitly understood to be Charlotte's future emotional inheritance, sacred objects intended to be passed down to her when she reaches maturity. The true value of these pieces did not reside in their immense financial worth or their status within the peerage, but in their unique capacity to provide Charlotte with a tangible, physical link to a grandmother she would never have the opportunity to meet in person. A woman whose historic compassion altered the trajectory of the monarchy and whose enduring spirit continues to shape the family's private life. The role of Catherine, the Princess of Wales, during this hidden chapter of palace history was both essential and deeply supportive. While she carefully maintained her flawless public discipline, executing her official duties with a serene composure that betrayed no hint of the internal storm, her actions behind closed doors were instrumental in strengthening William's resolve. Over the course of her marriage, Catherine has played an incredibly careful, intuitive role in preserving Diana's memory within their household, ensuring that Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis grow up with a deep, authentic understanding of their grandmother's human legacy. She has consistently resisted the temptation to allow that memory to be commodified or reduced to a mere public relations tool, choosing instead to keep it integrated into the quiet rhythm of their private family life. Sources close to the family suggest that Catherine possessed an intuitive understanding of why the brooch controversy felt so deeply personal, almost violating to her husband. She had witnessed firsthand the lingering, invisible scars left by the relentless scrutiny and institutional coldness that defined the final years of Diana's life. Therefore, she viewed the defense of the sapphire brooch not as a trivial dispute over royal property, but as a fundamental act of protection for her husband's emotional well-being and her children's rightful heritage. Her steadfast solidarity provided William with the secure emotional foundation he required to navigate the institutional friction, proving once again that the partnership at the center of Kensington Palace was built upon a profound alignment of purpose and a shared determination to define the future of the monarchy on their own terms. As the second chapter of this quiet conflict drew to a close, a moment of profound clarity occurred within the private residence that completely crystallized the stakes of the battle. Following a succession of particularly tense meetings with archival administrators, William was observed spending a quiet evening with Princess Charlotte, guiding her through a private discussion about her family's history. While the specific details of their conversation remain entirely private, staff members noted a visible shift in the emotional atmosphere of the household immediately afterward. The realization became overwhelmingly clear to the future king that the bureaucratic struggle over the sapphire brooch was no longer confined to the cold realm of administrative paperwork and court politics. It was actively casting a shadow over the peaceful sanctuary of his domestic life, potentially affecting the emotional landscape of his children. In that moment, any remaining willingness to compromise evaporated completely. This was never a mere battle over precious gemstones locked safely behind iron gates. It was an absolute defense of a family's sacred emotional truth against the cold, unfeeling machinery of institutional manipulation. The sapphire brooch had become the ultimate symbol of an enduring reality, that Diana's legacy was not a passive currency to be traded or negotiated away within the hidden corridors of power, but a vital, living force meant to be carried forward into the future by her direct descendants, untarnished by the political calculations of the contemporary court. The third and final phase of this unseen conflict erupted when the carefully guarded parameters of the palace's internal investigation leaked into the wider media landscape. For weeks, the communication teams at Kensington Palace had operating on the assumption that the brewing dispute over the Sapphire brooch could be quietly managed, brushed aside as routine administrative choreography, or completely ignored through a strategy of selective media silence. However, the institutional machinery of the British monarchy does not exist in a vacuum, and when several highly respected royal correspondents began making targeted inquiries about unusual shifting of historic heirlooms, the artificial silence shattered completely. Almost overnight, what had been a controlled bureaucratic disagreement transformed into a sweeping national and international media storm. Major publications began analyzing every public appearance, every delayed arrival, and every neutral expression shared between senior royals through the lens of internal palace friction. Factions within the media landscape began constructing dramatic narratives, pitting the traditionalist old guard against a modernized, emotionally protective future king. The public backlash intensified significantly as the story reached social media platforms, where millions of Princess Diana supporters openly questioned the transparency of the collection's administrative processes. For a public that still carries the vivid emotional memories of Diana's turbulent relationship with the institution, any perceived attempt to alter or quietly reassign her personal artifacts was interpreted not as a minor procedural update, but as an existential threat to her memory. The sudden explosion of public scrutiny put immense pressure on the court, exposing deep structural divisions that the family had spent years attempting to obscure beneath a polished surface of unity and tradition. At the center of this escalating public relations crisis stood King Charles III, who found himself navigating an exceptionally delicate and personally uncomfortable position. The monarch, balanced between the rigid demands of ancient institutional continuity and the fierce, uncompromising determination of his direct heir, faced a landscape that left very little room for neutral diplomacy. According to internal reports from the contemporary court, the king was deeply reluctant to allow this jewelry dispute to escalate into a prolonged public controversy, particularly given his ongoing focus on long-term health management and the delicate stability of the modern crown. On one hand, Charles had spent his entire life operating within the established rules of the old guard, a system where the crown's archival collections are managed by committee procedures rather than individual emotional attachments. On the other hand, he recognized that public sympathy was shifting rapidly and decisively toward William and Catherine. The Prince of Wales was not acting out of political ambition or institutional vanity. He was perceived by the global audience as a dedicated son protecting the physical dignity of his late mother's memory. This powerful emotional framing resonated deeply across generations, making it impossible for the sovereign to enforce a traditional bureaucratic resolution without risking a major drop in public support. Behind the scenes, the king reportedly acted as a stabilizing force, quietly intervening to de-escalate the friction between the competing households and ensuring that the administrative machinery of the palace began to slowly yield to the protective boundaries demanded by the future king. The resolution of the crisis, when it finally arrived, was not marked by a grand public announcement or a formal declaration from the press office, but by a series of definitive, strategic adjustments that quietly signaled a complete paradigm shift in the governance of the royal collection. Under the intense, combined pressure of William's unwavering stance, Catherine's disciplined solidarity, and the overwhelming wave of public support, the administrative paperwork that had initiated the secret transfer of the Sapphire brooch was permanently rescinded. The heirloom was quietly returned to its designated position within the core family archives, effectively secured under the protective umbrella of the unwritten preservation protocol. But the true significance of this outcome stretched far beyond the physical destination of a single piece of jewelry. It marked the exact historical moment where the traditional old guard of courtiers fully realized that the transition of power within the House of Windsor was already underway. William's handling of the entire crisis demonstrated a leadership style that will inevitably define his future reign, a method characterized by clinical precision, an absolute refusal to compromise on family values, and a formidable use of quiet, strategic power. He had successfully demonstrated to the entire institutional apparatus that while he remains deeply committed to the duties of the crown, those duties will never again be allowed to override or diminish the sacred emotional history of his family. The brooch had become a monument to an enduring truth, that the memory of Princess Diana is no longer a vulnerable legacy to be managed by palace committees, but an essential, living force firmly guarded by a son who is already ruling the emotional heart of the monarchy long before he ever wears the physical crown.